Okay, welcome to 604. Welcome to CH. Welcome to chapter 13, Global Pentecostal Christianities. We're going to look at Ghana, we're going to look at Brazil, and we're going to look at Pentecostalism. We're going to slip a little in terms of when we talk about charismatic movement, Pentecostalism, but we're mostly going to try staying focused on Pentecostalism. Stanley starts off by exploring how do we talk about God. He looks at evangelicals at, for example, Keswick Convention, and there sees a kind of practical modalist monarchianism. I love scholars. Never mind. Hope you can remember what modalist monarchianism is. But in terms of how evangelicals tend to focus on Jesus, Father and the Spirit, yes, we love, but Jesus does tend to be the focus of our attention and our preaching. When we read even the Old Testament, we're going to be looking to see what it has to say about Jesus. Pentecostals, you could say the same in regard to them in terms of how they focus upon the Spirit. And so in danger of falling for the heresy of oneness Pentecostalism. Again, a practical form of modalist monarchianism if they take that too far. Whereas Protestants looked for certainty and clarity as they explore the scriptures. Pentecostals, we're looking for new revelation. It's intuitive, it's spontaneous, it's spirit-driven. And so Leslie Newbegin sees Pentecostals as being that third stream, Catholics, Protestants, Pentecostals, that third stream. Pentecostals share with Protestants a tendency to downplay visible church order, church structure, and how Pentecostals share with Catholics that real desire to see your inner self change, that ontological change. He proceeds to define Pentecostalism as being to do with ecstatic experience and a tangible practice of spiritual gifts. But you'll see within Pentecostalism an interesting equality, irrespective of education, social class, gender, and this narrows the status gap that the historic churches had created. So at the root of Pentecostalism is equality, is a deep sense of equality. And so women end up being 65% of membership, and we'll see later a significant role of women in leadership. Pentecostals, invariably we're not very far away from talking about gift of tongues, sometimes necessary, evidence of being baptized. Gift of tongues is sometimes split between xenolalia, the speaking of an identifiable foreign language, or glossolalia, which another translated to me as the tongues of angels. I quite like that. Yes, they're not technically correct according to the Greek, but I still think that was quite nice. So before Azusa Street, the Spirit is at work, and there are some dates here that relate to that. But there's a feeling that that Azusa Street does light something, a touch paper that does spread very well. Vatican II seems to help, and we will see Pentecostalism have this huge effect in the nature of Catholicism, for example, in the Philippines and Brazil, and in Latin America, in terms of how it will affect Pentecostals, particularly. I hope you're familiar with John Wimber, or maybe it's just me indicating my age. And we needed to fit Alpha course in here somewhere, but I wonder whether you would have fit Alpha nearer the Pentecostal side of the mark or nearer the evangelical side of the line. And of course, it's so very flexible that it's able to be used by all sorts in different ways. But I needed to throw in Alpha course in there somewhere. We're going to see periodicals, magazines being at the early stage, being a key part of the transition of this worldview, of this theology. I'm familiar, I'm old enough to remember the cassette ministry. I used to get cassettes of Derek Prince, of Francis Schaeffer, and see what they were saying. So I do struggle a little bit, but I kind of understand it. I do struggle a little bit to see how magazines can have the sort of effect that we're about to see. So we come to 13.2, Pentecostal Christianities in Ghana, page 94. And we start off here with death. And we're seeing colonial medicine seemingly impotent. And here the churches step forward with the promise of healing and security to those who are under the power of Christ. Now, you see, here's the thing. If you're sick, then maybe we could try exorcising the demon of sickness out of you and seeing where that goes. We're familiar with this idea of Christ versus other gods approach to evangelism. We've seen it before, right the way back. Oh, it's just suddenly gone from my memory. Never mind, but we've seen it before. Now, there's a key question that if you are a proper born again, baptized, spirit filled Christian, can you still be subject to attack? And to begin with, the answer was no. You could not become possessed because now you are a temple of the Holy Spirit. And so you cannot have an additional demon possession. So remember that for a moment because we will come back to it in just a little tick. Now, there's a number of problems. Amongst the problems are, what do you do if somebody in your Christian church, if somebody falls ill or dies, what do you do? Now, one of the solutions was, well, you use additional stuff, candles, holy water, crosses, incense, Bibles, and we've seen this before when we were looking at what was it? Was looking at a mission in Africa. We've seen how there was an indigenous approach that looked to these things as extra, but the problem here is that they become extra Holy Spirit plus stuff. And so, are you introducing a Christian idol? There's a second problem here. The second problem is that in its own way, perhaps the Protestant missions have accidentally diabolized. This is a phrase of Stanley's, diabolized African indigenous religion. And in doing so, unwittingly gave the figure of the devil a prominence that he does not possess in the Bible itself. Now, on the one hand, this means that demons can be blamed for misfortunes, and that's good because we know what to do with demons. We expel them, we exorcise them, so we know what to do there. And that results in its own way by having pretty much all sorts of churches, Presbyterian Church in Ghana, losing younger generation to Pentecostal churches, so they too start to introduce healing, deliverance ministry type services, because that increasingly becomes the normative approach for how we're going to do our mission and our ministry. Third problem is looking at the failure of the prosperity gospel. It does worry me that this remains popular, but we will see bizarrely how prosperity gospel does work. Hang on for that in a moment. There's a bit here where the prosperity gospel works because it has tucked inside of it the Protestant work ethic, the call for hard work, for moral integrity, for less alcohol and tobacco, for supporting the family. And so using what little money you as a man perhaps have to go into the family and feed them and educate them. And so in the sheer fact that you're not smoking and drinking it, but sharing it and doing your husbandly responsibilities, the sheer approach to that brings about a form of prosperity. So there you go. But here's the question: are born again, spirit-filled, baptized Christians still subject to attack? Now, a later answer to this question was yes. The earlier answer was no, but the later answer was yes. You remember the importance of being continually vigilant and clean. You remember 1 Peter 5 verse 8, how the devil is a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. And so there's this importance by which we are to be constantly vigilant. Now, the thing is that that's all very well, but is it in danger of leading us back into a kind of pre-Reformation, the whole problem that Luther had? Well, when do I know that I'm forgiven? When do I know that I'm loved? When can I have that security which I can then live out from, which Luther finally arrived at? In this setting, there's no real security of having Christ indwelling in me. Over the page to 13.3, and Pentecostalism in Brazil. So I find very interesting because you've got a deep-seated Roman Catholicism there, particularly in Mexico, a deep Catholic devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. But by the end of the century, you're going to see 7 million Protestants. Most of them will be Pentecostals. The Pentecostal church grew significantly from the 1980s to reach a majority status among Brazilian Protestants, accounting for perhaps 2/3 by the year 2000. Where were you when we were struggling with our decade of evangelism, eh? Could have used you over here. Um, who knows whether that would have helped in the 1990s as Anglicans in this country, which were working on the decade of evangelism. So there's a stuff about southern Brazil, northern Brazil, and we see by the mid 1980s 30 million baptized members against your Catholic basic ecclesial communities we already talked about when we were looking at liberation theology of 5 million. So we're seeing this huge rise. That's the first wave. A second wave that comes on the back of Amy Semple McPherson, the church that she got going, and where we come across 35% of its Brazilian pastors were women by 1995. So that's really exciting and very positive. Into the third wave, and we're into buying up TV networks. Good Lord, how are these people doing that? Well, I suppose we're all televangelists now. Look at me. But here's somebody who's doing who's becoming this televangelist supreme. Now, here you end up with a cyclical, full circle irony, where it is the key man, who ends up being the key person who signifies what the Holy Spirit is saying and is about. So we've almost come back to this idea of the big man, the mana that we saw before. And in Anglican circles, we might call that Father Knows Best. And we've seen that produce various problems for ourselves here. So there are concerns there, I think, to be raised. Whereas liberation theology was keen to address the institutional issues of oppression and speak out, Pentecostal leaders tended not to do that, generally stood back from that. Liberation theology opted for the poor, and the poor opted for Pentecostalism. That's a quote attributed to an unnamed Latin American theologian. Stanley puts it on page 309. This personal spiritual power did not depend on any political transformation. And so it's about personal transformation in Pentecostalism rather than the liberation theology, the institutional transformation that we're seeing. Yeah, I feel like I've said a lot of what you find there on page 98. The only thing I was going to bring out at the very bottom of page 98 was my need to say somewhere in this course about food banks. Maybe it should have appeared under liberation theology stuff, because there we see the church supporting the poor, being with the poor. There you see a kind of English liberation theology shaming the government into doing more. But there probably should have belonged with the liberation theology chapter rather than Pentecostalism. But here's to the prayer that maybe they will send missionaries here to England. And who knows then what kind of missionary zeal might come to the Church of England if we were to be blessed with some Pentecostal missionaries from elsewhere. All right. Thank you for this evening.